Luis Alberto, I nearly missed introducing you, but Luis Alberto, most people will know here, ran the IDB for 15 years. So Luis Alberto, thank you very much for joining us. And then on screen, the great British economist, Charles Goodhart, who I'm hoping is going to just pop up here in a moment, and we can hear from too. Charles, there you are. Hello, how are you? I can see Charles, but we can't hear him. Sorry, Charles. Can we just double check we can hear from you? This has never happened before.
I'm not on mute.
Oh, yes, we've got you. Charles, you're here.
Great.
Charles, I'm going to start. Susanna and Luis Alberto are here, but I'm going to start with you, if I might, because we finished the conversation just before coffee, talking a little bit about how real the inflation risk was. And I wondered whether or not, given the conversation we're going to have about, and this is an attempt to understand the big divides, Jeremy Farrow was just talking about how much the pandemic had highlighted inequalities and divides, whether you could give us, if you like, a short-term and a medium, longer-term outlook for divisions in the global economy, particularly in the light of the concerns around inflation.
Fine, I'd like to do that. But first, can I please just have a comment on the final statements of the previous session?
Of course.
Where Jeremy said that he wanted to meet with Pablo in 20 years' time. Now, if I assume that both of them are getting up to about 60, the answer is that it's quite unlikely that they'll both be able to do that. And the reason is that one of the areas which science has not succeeded in meeting is the problem of the diseases of the aged, particularly neurodegenerative diseases, dementia and Parkinson's, to name but two. From the age of 65 to 75, which demographers call young old, you've got about a 30% chance of being incapacitated. Between 75 and 85, which is old, it goes up to 50. From 85 onwards, which is described as old, which I've now just joined, the probability of being incapacitated rises exponentially, and you are bound to become incapacitated. And one of the areas which we're going to all have to face in future decades is going to be the problem of an aging generation, which was not met and has not yet been dealt with by science in a sufficient way at all. But turning now to the point that you wanted me to touch on, which is inflation, we have had 3 or 4 decades of disinflation, and that's been driven by a surge in the working population, combined with a greater globalization, shift of production to China, and also the fact that with declining fertility rates and the increase in consumer durables, that half the population, i.e. the women, have moved primarily from doing housework, primarily to being part of the working population as employed. Now, as Jeremy was pointing out, sadly, globalization is currently in reverse, and demography is sharply in reverse because there are very few young people. The birth rate in almost all our countries, with the exception of Africa and the subcontinent, the birth rate, the fertility rate is below the rate of sustainability, which means that the proportion, the availability of workers is going to be declining quite rapidly from now on. And that is going to mean that the increase in inequality, which Jeremy was talking about, which was largely caused by a huge surge in the availability of labor, is going to be reversing, and within country inequality probably will be declining, and we are going to get shortages of labor, which has been pushed on and made much quicker by the COVID pandemic, and by the fact that a lot of people, having worked at home for a couple of years, are now questioning whether they want to rejoin the rat race. So we got shortages of labor, particularly in the advanced economies, combined with quite a sharp recovery thanks to the vaccines, together with very expansionary monetary and to a degree fiscal policies, particularly in the United States. And that is going to mean that the mini surge in inflation is probably going to go on for rather longer and be rather higher than has been predicted up till now by central banks and many mainstream economists.
And Charles, Charles, forgive me for interrupting, just so I understand, and I completely follow the arguments around the reverse of globalization, the reverse of the demographic patterns. If you're then saying you're going to see a change in the direction of inequality, a narrowing of that gap, but alongside possibly a longer period of higher inflation, what's the politics of that economic outlook?
Politics are difficult because anything to try and cut back on inflationary pressures, cut back on demand, are politically unpopular. Raising taxes is unpopular. Cutting benefits to the old, raising the retirement age is unpopular. Raising interest rates is not only unpopular because mortgage rates go up, but it also means that the fiscal deficit goes up. So in some ways, inflation is the form of taxation which is politically easiest to accept until it reaches the kind of levels that become politically unacceptable in themselves. And in many countries, take for example Turkey, to a degree also Mexico, the degree to which the unpopularity of raising interest rates or trying to tighten up on the fiscal side is such that some of the more populist politicians are prepared to suffer extremely high rates of inflation before they're prepared to clamp down on it through one kind of policy or another. And what's going to happen in the next year or two is that in the advanced economies, interest rates, nominal interest rates, are going to go up, and that is going to cause more difficulty to the advanced economies, which are suffering more because they have fewer vaccines. The supply constraints in these economies are just as bad as or worse than in the advanced economies. And so they're already under inflationary pressure. And when the nominal rates start going up in the advanced economies, slowly but steadily, probably starting in 2022, the capital flows into the developing world from the advanced economies will reduce and may even reverse, which will make life for the developing economies more difficult than it was before. And moreover, the rate of growth in the advanced economies, which has been very strong thanks to the vaccines in much of 2021, will probably slow down as the limits on the availability of labor to grow bite even harder and continue.
Charles, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a moment about the longer term outlook, but Susanna, will you respond to Charles? Because I suppose that 1 to 2 year outlook suggests a widening of that great divide. How do you see things in this shorter term?
Well, I would like to start, I'm not an economist, I'm not a banker, so I come from a very different angle. I would like to start answering your question from the geopolitics.
Yep.
Because the geopolitics today goes exactly against what Jeremy said in his speech, in his conversation. Geopolitics is divisive. Geopolitics is not geared towards having a common language. I was so thrilled to see that answer. What do we need? A common language in a conference. Well, we are far from a common language these days. We are really distancing ourselves from anything that is related to commonality, to share. And that in itself is exactly the opposite to what we need to close the gap, to narrow the gap between countries and within countries. And why is so? Because the challenges that really help us narrow that gap are global challenges in essence. So you cannot address them just coming from an angle, from a perspective. Jeremy made reference to the science, to sharing information, to the trust. All of that applies to, of course, climate change, but it applies to sustainability at large. And sustainability is about, no question, people, planet, and prosperity. And those things have to have common responses. So I am not optimistic about closing the gap, narrowing the gap, which, by the way, of course, has increased during the pandemic. But it has also increased in an uneven manner. It has increased much more in the developing world. And the fact that we don't have a fair distribution of vaccines, as it was referred earlier, only deepens that gap. So it is interesting that at a moment where globalization seems to be so rejected in so many places, it seems to be the common threat to most people is when we need globalization at its best.
And can I ask you, Susana, this time last year, we were joined by Ana Palacio, Spain's former foreign minister, your former counterpart, and she made the argument that global cooperation is not working, but there is some hope that, if you like, not the UN Security Council, not even the UN General Assembly, but some of those multilateral organizations, like the one that Luis Alberto used to run, but organizations like the OECD, for example, might step in and become places where practical cooperation really happens. And there's an argument, isn't there, that what we saw at the G20 around tax was that kind of cooperation in action. I know you don't expect a kind of optimistic question from me, but isn't it the case that there are forums where this kind of practical cooperation on a geopolitical level is happening?
I couldn't agree more with you and with Anna, my good friend Anna. Yeah. So I agree on that. And it's clear that what happened in Rome this past weekend is a very positive step forward. We need cooperation at regional level. We need integration, which is a problem in many parts of the world, including my region. But it's also true that we need coalition of the willing, countries that come together around an issue. But we cannot shy away from the fact that big power competition is a problem.
Yep.
And big power competition is there to stay. I think we need to recognize that. And how we manage big power competition can make a big difference. We can manage it towards confrontation. I'm not suggesting getting to the high-level confrontation, but confrontation. Or we can manage towards a way of living together, although recognizing there is competition. And that is not, the jury is there still. And that trickles down to the whole world. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you, there are opportunities. I think we need to rethink multilateralism at large, global understanding at large. We need to work around issues. Sometimes we become too ambitious and we try to embrace too many things and we can't. But in doing so, this backdrop of the big powers competition is a high risk and it's a threat.
Susana, I want to bring in Luis Alberto Moreno. I imagine you have responses to both things, both the outlook that Charles gave and to the questions about multilateralism. Luis Alberto, will you just give a sense of how you see the starting point, the Great Divide, particularly around Latin America and, if you like, Europe and the US?
Look, I think it's very important to begin, let's call it, with the pre-existing conditions that were there prior to COVID. What were those pre-existing conditions in Latin America, which are many of the key words that have been spoken about here? Questions of trust, questions of inequality, and this notion that is just about growth, absent the capacity to bring down inequality, will always create a political cleavage that allows for populism to thrive. And Latin America has consistently been the most unequal region of the world. And you have populism, if you want, Argentinians probably won't agree with this, from Perón to Chavez. And in that light, I think it's very important to understand something that Jeremy and others have said, is how this inequality within countries and across countries has only deepened. And the question of vaccines puts out there a sense of tension that is going to not only undermine trust between, let's say, the North and the South. What we all saw in front of us is how in the developed world, people are already moving as to the post-COVID moment, and in the emerging world, we're still in the midst of the COVID moment. Charles was talking about, and he sees him from a prism that on the macro level, he's right, but the reality is that countries in the emerging world with demographic bonuses like Africa or Latin America largely grew by the numbers of people entering the labor market. And that's what explained a lot of the growth. And I agree also with Susana in terms that these geopolitical tensions are essentially helping hollow out the center. How do we hold to that center that keeps things together? And I think that we are at a moment, because of COVID, of an acceleration of everything. An acceleration of a set of challenges that are probably going to be far more difficult to deal with in the emerging world than in the developed world, because the social fabric, the kinds of capital already existing in developed societies is very different. And therefore, it will put a tremendous pressure on emerging countries. And you saw it in the case of Latin America prior to COVID. You saw in a country as sophisticated, the poster child of good public policy like Chile, with people in the streets rebelling about a 30-cent increase in the cost of mass transit, saying it was not the 30 cents, it's the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Somehow we all came to the conviction, right, center, left, that whatever we accomplished was not good. But what we accomplished in 20 years was essentially to reduce poverty by almost half, to increase by almost twofold the numbers of people entering the middle classes, and now this huge erosion that is taking place by a combination of higher debt, by a combination of higher fiscal expenditures. And at the end of the day, what does this new social contract look like? And a social contract that doesn't have a capacity to have social mobility, to have cohesiveness, simply is going to break down. And I just finished with this. The OECD did some interesting numbers that basically pointed to certain countries in Latin America and how long it would take for people to move out of poverty. My own country in Colombia took essentially 12 generations, almost 250 years to move out of poverty and into being developed. If we continue to have those set of chances for the newer generations, we're in a lot of trouble. Now, as the great Panamanian singer would say, sorpresas te da la vida. We never know what will happen, but that's kind of what we got to hold to.
Well, in that spirit, I was struck, when Jeremy was saying, you need to take warning seriously. And I remember, I think it was attributed to Robert Samuelson, the economist. Economists have predicted, whatever it is, 9 out of the last 5 market crashes. I'm really aware that one of the concerns that people have got is that while we're focused on the transformation of the economy to green, or while we're focused on dealing with short-term issues around, inflation and cost of living, There are big structural risks in the economy, and the way Charles described it, those are the preconditions for a set of emerging market crises. And I just wondered, Luis Alberto, whether you could give us some sense of how seriously we should be warned of those risks, and if so, where?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think the history of the Latin American debt crisis began fundamentally with, what Charles was mentioning, the minute you start seeing a correction in interest rates. Today you have something that is not out there because you have the combination of a stronger, a dollar right now, which automatically benefits the non-tradable sector, with low interest rates and high prices of commodities. So you're kind of like in this period that the minute that it starts to correct through inflation, which is the way that a lot of the developed world, which basically adjust these huge debt levels that it acquired, immediately there will be a sudden stop, or at least the chances.
A sudden stop, did you say?
A sudden stop of financing. And the minute that happens, and you see it very quickly with very little variations in the market, as the famous temper tantrum that we saw some years ago, the minute there was even talk of that, you saw markets react very quickly, and you saw a huge widening of spreads in emerging markets.
And Luis Alberto, what do you watch for that? For all of us who can't see exactly when this is coming, what indicators do you watch to get a sense of whether or not that snaps about that?
Certainly is going to be what the ECB and the Fed are going to do. Are those movements in interest rates going to happen next year? How modular they will be? That is going to be critical. And certainly if we can continue to have growth, this will be another source of adjustment. There'll be arbitrage. But these are the risks that are out there, and I coincide with Charles. They're very real.
Susanna, can I come back to you in one moment? Sorry, did you want to jump in on that?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think what Luis has described shows the level of risk that the developing world, the emerging economies, our region, Latin America, is facing. Because, it is amazing the reaction that we have seen in the European Union, in the US, with these stimulus packages that are incredible. It can only produce envy in Latin America. There is no space for that in Latin America. There is no structure for that. So it will rely on something coming from the developing banks, from some of those support mechanisms, but it needs to borrow. It doesn't have this fiscal space. And if you need to borrow to do something that will not be at all to the tone of what is being done in this part of the world, and this reality in the future is true, where will the money come from? Not to widen the divide.
Can I go for a slight change of gear, Charles, if I might, which is, we're talking about the Great Divide, but we've not really talked about the big picture demographics. And I know you've done some work on this, and I'm just interested to know, if you take a decade-long outlook, are there things that in the shorter term, if we look at the shorter term, we're going to miss in the longer term?
The problem is that one of the ways of evening up the world would be for migration from the areas where the birth rates are still very high, Africa, India, and certainly in some parts of Latin America, to the richer areas where the working age population is actually soon going to be declining, certainly in Central Europe. But politics prevents that. And indeed, there's been very little discussion of what I just think of as the political realities. There's been lots of calls for international cooperation, but imagine what would happen to the political popularity of our leaders if they were to divert vaccines, which could otherwise go to, say, the 20 to 40-year-olds in their own countries, in order to send them so that the more vulnerable 60-plus-year-olds in the emerging economies could have their vaccines rather quicker. It doesn't work. And people like President Draghi got applauded when they refused to allow the export of vaccines. Again, it talks about international cooperation, sending money, tax money of our populations to support the greening of the economy in India and China might be a good way of doing international cooperation, but politically it's not going to work. Now, in the longer term, the great difficulty will be actually shifting capital and production to the areas where the working population is still growing. It'll be very hard, and it depends on the political, the governance ability and the education in the areas where the population is still growing. And that at the moment is not sufficiently good. And that means that we're likely to get a reduction in growth worldwide and stagflation worldwide. And the problem is that people are tribal by nature. They don't like using their own tax money or giving up on vaccines for their younger people in order to support people abroad. How do you actually cope in a tribal world in order to get international cooperation? It's no good just actually saying, we wish we had it, when it's not politically a likely outcome. So I'll leave it to my colleagues who want such greater international cooperation to say just how they're going to achieve that.
Nicely done, Charles.
Political pressures.
Very nicely done. Luis Alberto, I'll put that to you, but can I put it to you sort of quite starkly, which is the account that you gave of poverty reduction and the last 30 years or 20 years, is there a risk that actually we're headed into, as Charles says, not just a reverse of globalization, but a reverse of that picture or that narrative of poverty alleviation? Because populations grow in Africa, they grow in South Asia, and overall, the story that we've told ourselves in the last 5-10 years about globalization no longer holds true for very large parts of the world.
No question. I think that what is important to have in mind, and I think Charles pointed to the issue of migration, because the more accentuated inequalities in certain parts of the world, you're going to start to see a migration from the world of disorder to the world of order. And then the question becomes, how you reverse that when politically it's impossible to accommodate the numbers of people that are going to want to go for economic or whatever reasons and migrate. And here there's interesting things to explore. They have happened in Latin America in small examples, but not unimportant, like the large number of retirees that go, for instance, from the United States to countries like Costa Rica or Panama, and those numbers actually have been growing. Their public services are far more inexpensive. Somebody with who would be typical middle class would have a quality of life that is much better in those countries. I think another aspect that I think is very important for us to take into consideration is that when you look at the streets and what was happening prior to COVID, it was largely driven by younger generations. And I think it is critical to include younger generations into this wider discussion, because at the end, they're going to have the burden of these challenges in front of them in very big ways. And there is a split in that conversation, partly because it's a conversation that is not sufficiently informed, partly because there is this logical view that young people think there is a quicker way out to get out of this. But I do believe that this is a fundamental aspect that we must include into all of these conversations, such that this is going to be a time where entrepreneurship is going to be critical. What are the options in the labor market? More and more you're going to find that in this technological revolution that we're living, there's a lot of entrepreneurship taking place. All of these generations, we're seeing it right now, want to be in companies that have a sense of purpose, and they want to be associated with institutions and companies, not just because of the profit motive, but what they represent. And that's what's driving a lot of change inside businesses and in society. And again, this is kind of the green shoots that you see of what can be the way forward.
Susanna, I'm going to ask you to answer Charles's question, right, which is, how do you fix this problem? And taking on, if you like, the point that Luis Alberto made too, which is, it's not just geographical, it's generational.
Well, first, we need to realize that we are facing 21st century challenges with tools from the 20th century. So there is a need to adjust and adapt the tools. You know, the institutions we have, the political parties, the way they exist, the incentives that the politicians have, and Charles was referring to the answer of the politicians, the incentives that they have, which are very short term, are not geared towards thinking and investing in the long term as is needed. And that goes back to the question of the younger generation. Clearly, there is a divide here on the perspective of the younger generation that not only have to bear the cost of whatever we decide, starting with climate change, but not only climate change. But on the other side, you have an aging population that is a very significant part of the voting population that clearly politicians pay a lot of attention to. So how do you bridge that divide? How do you strike the balance and bring back, you know, there was a question of trust raised by Jeremy, which is essential, trust in institutions, but also hope. I will add to trust, hope. Part of that problem is that not only we are not trusting these institutions, these tools that we gave ourselves essentially in the past century, maybe at the end of the 19th century, we haven't adjusted them, but we also are not able to build the hope in something that will be different. You know, this notion that our children will be better than us, which was the American dream, that has been lost. So that is, to me, the essential question we need to address. And this is a question that goes back to the point that Luis Alberto referred to, which is a new social compact. And it's a compact that has to bring together, no question, governments, politicians, the broad range of political perspectives, the private sector, the ones that contribute to the engine of the economy, civil society, unions, but also cut across this intergenerational perspective. And I don't see that happening. To me, that is at the heart of what we need to address the challenges we have.
Susanna, okay, well, I hope, Jeremy, that we've lived up to your request not to be too romantic about the challenges that we face, anything but that. But I hope you'll also agree with me that this session has given us a way of looking at what's happening in the world beyond our own borders. And one of the curious things about the last year and a half is we faced a global pandemic, but being more than ever parochial or national in our thinking. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Luis Alberto, to Susanna, and to Charles for helping us see that bigger picture. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.